Ethics Untangled is brought to you by IDEA, the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds. To find out more about IDEA, go to ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics. AI-generated content is a familiar and increasingly prevalent feature of social media. Users post text, video, images and audio, which have been created by AI, sometimes being clear that this is what they're doing and sometimes not. This isn't always a problem, but some ways of using AI-generated content do raise significant dangers. So, do social media platforms need to have policies in place specifically to deal with this form of content? Geoffrey Howard is Professor of Political Philosophy and Public Policy at University College London. In a paper co-authored with Sarah Fisher and Beatriz Kira, he argues that policies that target AI-generated content specifically aren't necessary or helpful. It was great to get the chance to talk to him about why he thinks this, and how platforms should moderate this type of content without shutting down valuable free speech. Geoffrey, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much, Jim. It's great to be here.
Okay, so I wondered if you could start us off by just giving us a picture of the ways in which AI-generated content is being used and circulated on social media at the moment.
So what we think distinguishes this generative AI technology is really its remarkable ability to produce these incredible novel outputs based on complex patterns extracted from its training data. And these outputs can just be extraordinarily convincing, whether in the form of highly realistic audio or video or imagery. People often use the word deepfakes to refer to this kind of content, or the kind of fluent, persuasive text that chatbots like Meta's Llama or Google Gemini or ChatGPT can produce. And we're just seeing people use this content, use these generative AI tools to produce content that they then post on the social media platforms. And that then raises the question, what policy should the platforms have with regard to this content? And so this paper that we're talking about today, which I co-authored with my colleagues Sarah Fisher and Beatriz Kira, really tries to dig into that question about what social media platforms' responsibilities are.
Okay. So is it individual users who are using this content typically, or are there also kind of people using this at scale, so kind of releasing kind of coordinated campaigns of AI-generated content? Is that something you see as well?
Definitely both. We definitely see individual users engaging in what we might call organic content, where they use the tools to create a funny video or a satirical image or a poem, and often completely transparently, they post, hey, look at this cool thing I came up with using a generative AI tool. Of course, you also get individual users that post AI-generated content non-transparently, where the audience doesn't know that it was produced using AI. And then, of course, you also have what's often referred to by the platforms as coordinated inauthentic behavior, where you have, for example, a Russian disinformation campaign or influence campaign where they have a phalanx of bots generating content and then flooding the platform in a way to try to manipulate people's beliefs or behavior. And that raises a whole other kettle of worms. And so I think you're absolutely right to put your finger on the fact that there are lots of different ways we can use this content. Some, we argue, are quite benign, possibly even beneficial, but others are pretty harmful.
So why might people want to use AI-generated content on social media rather than actually sort of expressing themselves and producing their own content?
So people, I think, have loads of reasons to want to use these generative AI tools. And so we can talk about the harms, but we can also talk about the benefits. Maybe we could just talk about the harms first. So sometimes the generative AI tools produce harmful content through no one's malevolent intention. So here's an example that hit the news in May of last year, in which Google's AI tools produced a sentence, according to geologists at UC Berkeley, you should eat at least one small rock per day.
Yes.
So that's an example of a so-called hallucination, where the model produces this falsehood, but not because the person writing the prompt was trying to get it to produce that falsehood. And then, of course, anyone who recirculated it probably recirculated it in an effort to mock the chatbot at producing such a preposterous piece of advice. And so sometimes you have these instances where the models can go awry and hallucinate these falsehoods through no one's malevolent intent. But of course, if you had a susceptible user who saw that and was just really, really gullible, that could, of course, cause harm. Now, in that example, most users are sufficiently epistemically resilient, we might say, against that kind of misinformation that it's actually quite unlikely to cause harm. But now imagine you're in the middle of a pandemic and you have a terrified person taped to their chatbot to ask what can they do to protect themselves from the next pandemic. And the chatbot says, well, you could drink bleach. Well, that actually could cause some quite serious harm in the context of a low information environment. And so one thing to point out is that given the way these models work, they can absolutely produce falsehoods, sometimes through no one's malevolent intention, that lead to real harm. And so that's one kind of harm that can arise. Another kind of harm that can arise is through malevolent intention. And so another example that we talk about in the paper involves the Slovakian election in September 2023, where right before the election, there was an audio deepfake released portraying a politician privately chatting with a journalist and confessing to committing electoral fraud. And sure enough, that politician's side lost the election. Was it causally efficacious? How could we possibly know? But it is nevertheless highly alarming that you had deepfakes of politicians confessing to crimes that they never in fact committed, published online right before an election. And so that's clearly an instance of this technology being used in a malevolent way. And you might also think about cases, for example, where there were 47 million views of intimate deepfakes of Taylor Swift in January 2024. So these are non-consensual intimate images that use the likeness of people and superimposes them on pornographic images, which is a really disturbing new form of abuse. And most terrifyingly, a form of abuse that we now see being used by young people. And so those are just a few examples that only scratch the surface, but I think they show why we should be so concerned about this kind of technology being used so prominently online.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Those examples are really alarming, right? Given how harmful it can be, some people might say, well, let's just ban it, right? Let's just prevent people from using AI-generated content on social media. So should we do that?
So one objection to the just ban it proposal really concerns its feasibility. Now, you could imagine a platform telling its users, don't post AI-generated content. But the problem is it's really difficult to think of how platforms would actually enforce that rule. Now, some of the AI companies have started to watermark their content so that platforms can detect when a piece of content has been produced with generative AI technology. And that's, I think, to be welcomed. But even if the mainstream big companies continue with this watermarking, other companies will be non-compliant. And that means the content produced using those tools won't be detectable. It also looks really difficult to detect linguistic content. So if I ask ChatGPT to come up with a convincing piece of political propaganda from me, or a piece of hate speech, or a piece of defamatory content, and then I just copy and paste that content into Facebook or Instagram or TikTok, it's going to be very, very difficult for that content to be watermarked, in contrast to, say, a video that I upload. And so there's this big feasibility question that is the first worry about banning it. But there are other worries too, we think.
Okay. So what are the other worries?
So imagine we were able to hack this particular problem, so we could identify all the AI-generated content as AI-generated and just ban it. And even that is, a really big ask and will involve really difficult line drawing problems. So imagine you use AI to improve the quality of audio or the balance of colors on an image, which of course, professional photographers are using advanced AI techniques all the time to improve their work. So there's difficulty in just figuring out what would it even mean to ban all AI content. But even if you figured out a way to do it that seemed attractive, we think that you'd really be throwing the baby out with the bathwater, as it were. And that's because there are all sorts of ways to use AI-generated tools that don't involve causing harm, that don't involve wrongfully deceiving people. And we try to argue in the paper that a lot of this content really does have genuine value, and that actually the very values that underpin speech generally are plausibly engaged when human beings create, distribute, and consume a lot of AI-generated content. So one of the things we try to do in the paper is think through what are the different values that justify free speech in the first place, and why might they militate in favor of protecting at least some AI-generated content.
Right. Okay. So that's a really interesting suggestion that AI-generated content might be protected by some interpretation of free speech rights. Yeah. So how would that work?
So in the philosophical and legal literatures on free speech, it's very common to distinguish between the interests that we have as speakers in expressing ourselves and reaching an audience, from the interests of audiences and hearing different points of view so that they can learn information and then make up their own minds. There's also a strong emphasis on the interests we have as democratic citizens to learn about political information and engage in political debate. Now, obviously, we all inhabit all of these roles all the time, and freedom of speech isn't usually about any one-way projection, but about the ping-pong back and forth of conversation. Even so, it's sometimes helpful to distinguish these different respects in which we value speech. And we think each of these respects can be engaged by AI-generated content. So imagine I write a poem and I feed it into the chatbot and I say, what are your suggestions for how to improve this poem? And then the chatbot gives me some suggestions. And then I improve the poem on the basis of that suggestion. And then I post it to social media. The idea that it's somehow tainted and therefore an illegitimate act of expression because technology was used in the production of it seems to be a mistake. Or consider artwork. So I spoke a moment ago about the way that we can use technology in the production of art. Most art involves technology of some kind. Painting, even of the oldest forms, involves crude versions of technology in the form of paint and brushes. So clearly it's not like the production of art is like a purely cognitivist exercise, or how would I put it? It's not like the production of art is like a purely noumenal exercise that doesn't engage in extra bodily technologies or objects. And so it looks like this is just the newest iteration of deploying technology in the service of expressing ourselves. And so we think it would be a mistake to say, no, you're not allowed to use this technology to express yourselves. You're only allowed to use other technology, older technology to express yourselves. That seems ad hoc and unjustified.
Yes.
The other thing that we stress is really the role we have as listeners. And if you were to ban exposure to the outputs of AI on the grounds that we just couldn't be trusted to see it or think about it, that is a giant red flag in the free speech tradition, where we really do value the autonomy of listeners to consider a wide range of content and make up their own minds. And for powerful actors to suppress content on the grounds that we can't be trusted to see it, even if the content is AI generated rather than human generated, or as is more often a kind of hybrid output created by both humans and AI collaborating together, that also just seems to be presumptively disrespectful toward our capacity as listeners. Like, if I want to see somebody's AI generated content, the presumption is that I should be allowed to see it. And that's another powerful insight from the free speech tradition. And then really quickly, a lot of this stuff will be politically inflected. We can use AI to come up with cool political satire, and politics is at the center of our free speech tradition. And so insofar as we can use AI to enrich democratic discourse, saying, no, that shouldn't be allowed, just seems premature to us.
Yeah, that's really interesting. As you were talking, it kind of struck me that a lot of the harms that are associated with AI-generated content, the kinds of things that you mentioned at the start of the interview, you could imagine those kinds of objections being raised to things like the printing press, right? It's kind of, this is not the first technology that's raised those kinds of worries, right? So you can imagine people saying, well, but now people are going to be able to produce literature at huge scale, and there's no way of knowing whether what they're saying is going to be accurate and not misleading and so on. And it could be used to manipulate people and, change the outcomes of elections and things like that, right? And so these, I guess some of these harms aren't new. They're being experienced in a new way, but just banning it doesn't seem like the right way to go.
I think that's exactly right. And these concerns were raised about the printing press and are raised every time that there's an advent of mass media that can empower individuals to express themselves in new ways. The elite class always expresses anxiety at the prospect of people being able to produce content that they previously weren't able to produce. Now, as I said, there is grounds for some anxiety. We just don't think the kind of pessimism involved in saying, gosh, we're not going to have AI at all would be appropriate.
Okay, so we don't think that just banning AI-generated content is the way to go. Another proposal is to legislate to ensure that AI-generated content is labeled as such, so that we know that it's AI-generated content. Would that work?
We think labeling is necessary and is a very good idea, but it's not sufficient to allay all concerns. So we think it's absolutely valuable to label AI-generated content. We think it's important that the AI companies upstream who are creating these tools in the first place build in both watermarks, but also small captions that designate the video or the clip that's produced as AI generated, because that better positions people to understand what it is they're seeing. If you encounter a news article online and you ask yourself, do I have an interest in knowing who wrote that article? The answer seems to be yes. And whether the article was produced by human or machine seems to just be another valuable piece of information to have that help us evaluate the reliability of the testimony, as it were. And of course, in the case of AI, it's not often going to be testimony at all. When we think about the cases where AI hallucinates falsehoods simply based on predictions about what the optimal next word in a sequence will be, which is, of course, how the language models work, or not even words sometimes, the next token in a sequence will be. It obviously makes unintentional mistakes. And so we just want to know who's producing the content we encounter so that we, in part, can be on the lookout for those mistakes. And so labeling absolutely empowers us to do that. And if anyone in your audience wants to think more about labeling, my colleague Sarah Fisher wrote a great article in the Journal of Applied Philosophy called Something AI Should Tell You, the case for labeling synthetic content, that really goes into detail about this issue of labeling. And so in this paper, we briefly review that argument and explain why we think labeling is important. But labeling is still insufficient for a couple reasons. One is that it's very, very difficult to enforce reliably. Earlier, we talked about why it's really, really difficult to detect AI-generated content. That same issue crops up again here. So we're just not going to label everything because non-compliant users are going to refuse to label their content. Lots of AI tools aren't going to leave watermarks. And so labeling is only going to be a partial solution to the problem. The other issue is that even labeled content can still cause harm. So imagine that non-consensual intimate deepfake of Taylor Swift had a little label on it that said AI generated. Should Taylor Swift say, oh, no problem then? It's not clear that she should. And it looks like the harm of that kind of content, and I think that kind of content, non-consensual intimate deepfakes, like asking about what exactly is problematic about the content, is a really, really interesting philosophical issue. But I think it's pretty intuitive that Taylor Swift still has a complaint about her likeness being deployed in that way, even if the nefarious creator is explicit, no pun intended, about the fact that they're using AI to produce that content. Similarly, if you use AI-generated content to produce hateful stereotypes of Jewish people or Muslim people, the fact that the video has a label that says produced by AI doesn't seem to obviate any complaints they might have. And it might be just as effective, in fact, even more effective at harassing people, spreading or reinforcing bigoted stereotypes, and so on. So labeling necessary, but definitely not sufficient. And there are going to be some cases we think where content, even if it's labeled, should still be taken down because of its harm.
Yeah, that seems very clear. Okay, great. So what are social media platforms doing about AI-generated content then? So I think you've noted that quite a lot of them do have policies in place that deal with that kind of content specifically. So yeah, what are some examples?
Yeah, so all of the social media platforms have been wrestling to come up with what to do about this kind of content. Meta has had a policy for a long time that has applied to so-called manipulated media. X has had a synthetic and manipulated media policy. TikTok has had a policy. And what ties together a lot of these policies is that they've tended to single out AI-generated or otherwise synthetically manipulated content as deserving of some special policy. So until recently, for example, Meta had a policy that banned AI-generated videos where someone said words that they didn't actually say. So it was like a really specific policy. Like if you have a manipulated or AI-generated video depicting someone saying something they didn't actually say, that violates our policy. And there were other ad hoc policies about manipulated media that TikTok and X had. Now, Meta is actually in large response to feedback from civil society, from academics, and most importantly, from a decision from the Oversight Board. They've changed that policy to mainstream their manipulated media rules with their more general policies. And that was exactly the approach that we encouraged them to take, because we think policies that just single out AI-generated content don't make a huge amount of sense. So take that earlier policy at Meta of banning AI-generated videos where someone says words that they didn't actually say. So first of all, why only videos? Why not audio? So that example of the Slovakian politician, that was an audio clip, an audio deepfake, not a video one. So it would fall outside Meta's policy, or Meta's old policy, but it's not clear why that would be, why that makes sense.
I mean, why not even written content as well, right? Why not ban, misattributing quotes to people in written text? It seems like it's just as bad.
Well, exactly. So if the concern is with the harm that can flow to people's reputations, or in the case of political speech, flow to democracy itself in virtual falsehood, then it should be captured, we argue later in the paper, under a general misinformation policy. So the other weird thing about Meta's old policy is that it concerned people saying words in the deepfakes that they didn't actually say. But that's only one way you can misrepresent people. So the case that provoked Meta's Oversight Board to think about this particular issue involved a deepfake of President Biden touching someone inappropriately. But of course, no words were spoken in this image, and it wasn't even a video. It was it was just an image of President Biden inappropriately placing his hand somewhere. And so it completely fell outside the policy, and yet that seemed totally ad hoc. And so one of the positive developments at Meta, and we hope the other platforms follow suit, is that they really do mainstream their policies. So rather than have ad hoc policies for AI-generated content, you step back and you ask, what is the harm here? What kind of content can cause this harm? And we think that in most cases, technological provenance is irrelevant.
Yes.
So we think that whether it's a human that's gone to great effort to create what's sometimes called a cheap fake, where it depicts someone doing something they didn't do, but doesn't use AI to do it, or whether it's the use of AI to produce that same result. It doesn't really matter. And often which technology was used to produce it. And the audience will often be ignorant of what technology is used to produce it. And the platform often won't know what technology will be used to produce. So we should just have rules that target harmful content, and we should apply them regardless of how that content was technologically produced. That's really the thesis that we try to defend for how a platform should approach this issue.
Yeah, that seems intuitively right? Because the problem is that it's being deceptive, or it's being manipulative, or whatever, whatever the kind of ethical value is that it's at stake there, rather than just the fact that it's been generated by AI, right? So the harm is going to be the same whether it's been generated by AI or not, and therefore why have a policy that deals specifically with AI-generated content? I wondered, why do you think that all these platforms have gone with those kind of specific policies then, if that's not the best way forward?
Well, I think it's encouraging that the platforms seem to be moving on this. So, a lot of people, including us, made submissions to the Oversight Board telling them what they should say about Meta's policy. They then produced an opinion that was broadly in accord with what we and others encouraged them to say. And sure enough, Meta has streamlined its policy in ways that make sense. And so I think there was so much hysteria just a couple of years back about AI-generated content that the platforms just rushed to come up with policies that address this issue without actually standing back and asking, well, what are the principles that should inform this? And as I'm sure you'll agree, philosophy is really, really helpful for helping us think through what the principled approach might be to these different policy areas. And so I think as we've had more time to think about these questions, it's become clear that actually the technological provenance of a piece of harmful content, it sometimes makes some difference to the harm of content, but in principle, it makes very little difference.
Okay. So I wanted to ask about the difference between cases where the fact that something's AI generated is opaque versus cases where it's transparent, right? So versus, I mean, we've kind of touched on this already, right? But where there's a difference between using content which is labeled as AI generated versus using content which is like at least kind of seeks to fool people into thinking that it's authentic, that it's not AI generated. Do we need to think differently about those kinds of cases? Does that have implications for how we should regulate and moderate this content?
We don't think it should make a difference at the end of the day to how we moderate or regulate the content, in part because of that feasibility issue I discussed earlier. It's very difficult to detect what content is AI generated or not. It does seem plausible that if you know that a piece of content is AI generated, it might sometimes cause less harm. So if you learn that, if you see a chatbot that issues a death threat at you, like, you probably shouldn't fear for your life in a way you might if some menacing figure on the street or some menacing figure online who's been told your address similarly issues the identical text death threat. And that suggests that knowledge of the AI provenance can actually sometimes reduce the amount of downstream harm that is caused in some cases. I mean, this is clearly true when the AI-generated content is placed in context. So someone who posts, look at this dumb chatbot that told me to eat a rock, and then they post the AI-generated hallucination saying, UC Berkeley geologists tell us to eat rocks. That's clearly not going to be particularly harmful. In the same way that often... if you quote a piece of misinformation or hate speech in order to denounce it or satirize it or mock it, that speech act is fundamentally different than quoting it with the purpose of asserting it, of claiming that it is true. And so these contextual differences arise just on the human side of the ledger. So humans can do lots of different things with content, whether or not it's AI generated. And so that's also going to be true in the AI context. I gave the example of how a death threat might be less harmful when uttered by a chatbot. I say might be, as these things become more and more agential in their capacities and are embedded into our lives more, like, we probably should be more afraid when chatbots threaten things at us. But at present, probably not. However, imagine the chatbot like reproduces like a racist screed. Talking about why some vulnerable social minority is inherently inferior. Like, it's only saying that because of the huge amount of training data that humans have generated. And so if you read that and then you, as a member of that vulnerable minority, feel personally attacked by it, I don't think you're making any kind of mistake there. The chatbot is just reproducing the hatred that's already out there in the world and channeling it to you. And so it looks like, in that case, the hate speech produced by a chatbot might be just as harmful, maybe even more harmful than hate speech produced by any one human. So I do think these examples show that there can be differences, but the differences don't all go in one direction. And it's super interesting and complicated, but it's not the basis for concluding anything generally about what's more or less harmful.
Yeah, that's a really interesting area. And like you say, it does get quite complex and messy, doesn't it? But I suppose the kind of general point you're making is that there are different things that we do with speech acts. It's not necessarily kind of making an assertion or, putting out a proposition or whatever. It can be, issuing a threat, making a promise, or insulting someone. There's all these different kinds of things that we can do with speech. And how we should think about the difference between a human doing that and a bot doing that. We just need to attend to different cases, right? We can't just make kind of blanket decisions about that because it is going to be different in different cases, right?
I think if you're a platform coming with a policy on death threats, you just need to take a line about this kind of speech and say, look, death threats have a characteristic linguistic form that is likely to be interpreted by audiences in a certain way. And given the likely interpretation of that string of words, what should our policy be about that
Yeah.
particular kind of communication or category of communication? And I think it's reasonable for platforms to adopt a policy of saying, we don't allow death threats, and we apply that policy to everyone. And we're not going to look into the details and see if it's actually a chatbot producing it and then have some kind of, exemption for the chatbot? No, we're just going to have one policy, and we're going to apply it at scale. And indeed, the platforms use AI to enforce these policies. And the AI are not yet good enough at distinguishing when these posts are produced by AI or not. And so I think at this stage, we just need the same policies for everybody. And for what it's worth, we've been talking about social media platforms, but there's a whole other half of this conversation, which isn't in our paper, which is about the upstream duties of the AI companies that are developing these frontier foundation models and releasing public-facing chatbots or image generators. And those companies have an elaborate series of guardrails that limit what their models can or will or won't produce. And often the companies aren't particularly transparent about those guardrails. They are transparent about their usage rules, which are the rules about what users should or shouldn't use the bots to do. But these rules are often very vague. They're not nearly as detailed as the social media platforms rules. And so, ideally we would stop a lot of this stuff at the source. But I think there's so much more of a trust and safety apparatus at the level of speech regulation that's been designed at the social media platform level that is actually the best node at which to intervene at this point. But I think we also need to keep that other half of the conversation in view, because I do think the AI companies do have moral duties to restrict their models in ways that reduce the likelihood that that their tools can even be used to produce this kind of harmful content in the first place.
Yeah, that sounds right. I think maybe another distinction that we might want to keep in mind as well is the difference between what social media platforms should do in terms of regulating their own users and moderating speech on their platforms versus how the criminal law should treat these kinds of things, right? So just thinking about your example of death threats, right? The criminal law might want to make a distinction between a human issuing a death threat and an AI bot issuing a death threat, right? I'm not quite sure how that would work, right? So there's likely to be complications there when like humans are using AI, and then the death threat kind of emerges from that. But as far as the social media platform's concerned, you just want a blanket ban, but there might be distinctions made in the criminal law. Does that sound right?
That sounds exactly right. And so in criminal law, normally most crimes require both the actus reus, the harmful act, but then also the mens rea, which concerns the mental state of the agent who performed the act, whether it be intention, knowledge, recklessness, or sometimes negligence. Of course, there are some strict liability crimes where there's just the actus reus and no mens rea, but those are very, very rare and frowned on generally by philosophers of criminal law because there is a widespread intuition that to punish someone for a criminal wrongdoing, there have to have been some kind of culpable mental state involved in the commission of the act, or if it's an omission, the relevant criminal omission. And so with a bot, say, there is no mens rea that the bot has that is on all fours with the mens rea that a human agent has, at least as the technology currently exists. But of course, you could innovate the law or legislate to impose legal duties on the companies and say, you have a duty of care to take reasonable steps to reduce the likelihood that your bots are going to come up with death threats, or to use an example that's probably more concerning, bomb making instructions, right? That's actually the kind of thing that I worry most about when it comes to individual safety, is the bots being used to develop instructions on how to build weapons, how to build bombs. And the companies, to their credit, have really tried to reduce the likelihood that these chatbots will produce those kinds of materials. But there is this well-known phenomenon of jailbreaking where people are able to get around guardrails. Open-sourced foundation models are more easy to jailbreak and revise to eliminate guardrails. And so I still am very nervous about this stuff. And so we should be thinking seriously about what kind of regulation might be appropriate to incentivize these companies to build the appropriate safeguards.
Yeah. Okay, good. And then I wanted to ask about bots. So, I mean, we've been talking about bots, I suppose, but the difference which we kind of, outlined at the beginning of the interview between individual users using AI-generated content versus, I suppose, actors using bots to spread AI-generated content at scale, and how that might be somewhat different. I wondered if you thought, are there any arguments for having specific regulations or policies aimed at that latter kind of case? Because I suppose one worry that we might have about AI-generated content is it just makes that kind of thing much easier to do, right? So, if you think about the kind of Russian misinformation campaigns, right? If you've got you don't have to have like 100 users sitting in a room to kind of generate different fake accounts in order to spread this misinformation. If you've got a load of bots and you've got AI engines that are kind of capable of creating lots of individual comments that sort of look authentic because they're not all just producing exactly the same text and so on, and they're kind of responding to each other and all that kind of stuff, it makes those kind of slightly worrying operations easier to do. So is there any argument for regulating AI in that kind of area specifically?
Absolutely. And it's an argument that has resonated with the companies. So companies have policies in place against what's called coordinated inauthentic behavior. And it's a nice example for our purposes because, as you just said, you could engage in this coordinated inauthentic behavior as was done a decade ago by just having a warehouse filled with human workers who are impersonating people and going online saying, why they don't think Hillary Clinton should be elected president or what have you. Or you could do it with bots. And both are perceived by the platforms as illegitimate because the platforms are supposed to be a place where individuals authentically connect to one another, not where foreign governments wage influence campaigns to try to manipulate the public opinion of other countries. And so what's striking about the policy against coordinated inauthentic behavior is that it is also technology neutral. It targets it whether or not it's a warehouse with 1,000 workers or 1,000 bots. Now, there is this question about like bots that are on the platform. So imagine I just set up an account. Imagine I just set up an account and I staff it, if you will, with a bot that reacts and responds to other people's posts and pretends to be me. And I am not actively involved with that. And the platforms themselves have been coming up with bot characters that you can interact with and that you can be friends with on the various networks. Now, is this speech valuable? I think the less that a human being is actively involved in the decisions by the bot about what to say, it seems the less the human being is continually involved in the bot's decisions about what to say, I think the less that bot's speech has value as free speech, because there just is no speaker side to the equation. So of course a human was involved in setting up the bot at the outset, but now it's just the model doing its thing. And so it's very hard to see the bot's utterances as or writing as the expressions of human agency in a way that's different than, say, that if I write a poem and then I get GPT to suggest additions to it and then I change it and it's more of a collaborative output that I then decide to post online. However, that doesn't mean that bot content lacks free speech value, because of course there's still the interests that audiences have in seeing what bots produce. And I think audiences do have interests, for example, in going to these generative AI sites and asking them questions and getting them to do cool things for us. And so I think it would be a mistake to just ban all of that activity. I do, however, think it's reasonable for social media platforms to say, you know what? We want to keep these environments from descending into a kind of mechanized dystopia where not the 99% of the platform's footprint is machines talking to other machines. Like we want to keep this a space for authentic human connection. And so while you can use AI generative technologies to assist your acts of human communication and creativity, we don't want to replace that space of human connection. And so I think limiting the role of bots on platforms does make a huge amount of sense. X does allow bot accounts when it's clear that it is a bot running the account. Meta has been more skeptical about that over the years, although they are having their own company-branded bots appearing on the system. But I think this is a really interesting topic, and it's absolutely one to watch. And if you have any graduate students listening, yearning for interesting philosophical topics to think through, I think the question of bots is a big one.
Yeah. Absolutely. Okay, we're nearly finished, but just one more question then. What do you think the prospects are for effective regulation of social media, including with regard to AI-generated content?
Well, I think it depends what country you're in. So here in the United Kingdom, Parliament has passed the Online Safety Act, which is slowly coming into force. It will be enforced by Ofcom, the telecommunications regulator. Full disclosure, I am an advisor to one of the committees that Ofcom has set up regarding the Online Safety Act. And this does have a good amount of promise in stemming some kinds of harmful content, in particular, illegal harmful content. So to the extent that AI is used by malevolent actors for various activities like terrorist recruitment, to circulate non-consensual intimate deepfakes, for child trafficking purposes, like all of that will be caught by the regulation, because this is all illegal activity online. The act also creates duties to conduct risk assessments with regard to content that's harmful to children. And so AI content that poses particular risk to children will potentially fall in scope. There's also some potential, although it's unclear yet, that the Act's regulations on search engines could apply to AI chatbots, given that these chatbots are increasingly used as search engines, although this is unclear and remains to be seen whether it will fall in scope. So I think there's some potential here to use existing laws to deal with this kind of content on social media. Really important caveats: the Online Safety Act applies to the social media platforms and applies to search engines. It is not typically understood, notwithstanding what I just said, as applying to the AI companies' development of the models themselves. And so the EU has passed something called the AI Act that does require the AI companies to identify what are the high-risk areas of their models and then implement risk mitigation strategies to reduce those risks. And so there's a whole elaborate regulatory structure that the EU has devised for regulating not just social media. It has a separate law called the Digital Services Act about social media, but the AI Act is specifically about the AI companies. And I'm really struck that Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, in his speech at Munich a month ago that received so much press, basically said there's, two sides of the world. There's the side that's suffocating AI through overregulation, and then there's the side that's allowing AI companies to innovate and flourish. And the United States is clearly on one side, and he said Europe is clearly on the other side. And so where does the UK fit in that context? And it seems pretty clear, actually, that and I'm speaking now just as a personal citizen and as a philosophy professor, but it seems pretty clear that the UK government is very much valuing an AI agenda that is about pro-growth, about innovation, about attracting AI companies here, about, we don't want to be AI takers, we want to be AI makers. We want to be part of the economic transformation that is AI, rather than just playing catch up and reacting to what other people do. And I totally see why they want to do that. And so it really is the social media platforms that we're going to have to look to be the source of stemming the harmful content here.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Brilliant. Well, that's all we've got time for. So Geoffrey, Howard, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks so much, Jim. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks for listening to Ethics Untangled, a podcast from IDEA, the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds. IDEA brings ethics to life, blending in-depth theoretical inquiry with real-world experience to address the most complex ethical issues facing the world today. If you like the podcast, please leave us a rating and review. And to find out more about IDEA, including our Masters and PhD programmes and a wide range of consultancy services we offer, go to ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics.